So coming to that point where we begin to work seriously in this spiritual dimension of our lives, or seeing our life as a spiritual path, it can be a bit of a mixed blessing at first. On the one hand, it begins to put things in focus. We begin to get our priorities straight. We begin not to waste time so much, or to be controlled by false ideas or illusions. So we begin to see what are the real values in life we want to develop and commit ourselves to. On the other hand, there was something comforting about being caught up in that illusory world. It was involved us in avoidable suffering. On the other hand, it meant we didn't have to do the serious work necessary for our complete human integrity. We could still be driven by immediate desires and goals and entertainments and so on. So there's a process of transition in this stage, and indeed maybe a continuous one, in which we are discovering what it means to be real, what it means to see life itself as having a spiritual goal and purpose. So this is the work. This is the ongoing work that we had now got into since we took the second step. And again, the different spiritual traditions acknowledge this and help us to deal with it. The Buddha, one of the last things that the Buddha said before he died was, "Strive with vigilance." Work. It's almost a translation, sometimes it is actually given as a translation of St. Paul in the letter to the Philippians. Work out your own salvation, St. Paul says. Work out your own salvation. Sounds very Buddhist, doesn't it? You've got to work at this for yourself. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Well, again, the fear and trembling needs to be explained, I think. He uses that phrase in another letter, letter to the Corinthians, to describe what he felt like when he came to visit this little church in Corinth, and how he was frightened and nervous about meeting them. He felt vulnerable. So it's fear and trembling, not in the sense that you're terrified of being punished, but it's the natural admission of our vulnerability and of our own uncertainties. But it's working at becoming whole. That's what salvation means, becoming whole. Doesn't mean being found innocent or being given a suspended sentence. Salvation means being healed, salus, health, wholeness. So work out your own wholeness with a realistic embracing of your vulnerability. So don't expect to be perfect. St. Paul understood this, better than anyone, having gone through such a major change of mind as he did at the moment of his conversion, when he stopped becoming a Taliban, persecuting people who didn't agree with him, and became a disciple. It took him some time to make that transition. But even then, he carried over into his new way of life quite a lot of that earlier conditioning where he expected and thought he should be perfect. And when he discovered that he had, whatever it was, a thorn in the flesh, he asked God to take away this thorn in the flesh because he would be a more perfect disciple if he could be free from it. He kept on asking to be made perfect, and he wasn't. And then he understood, God said to him, he understood that it was good for him to have this fault. Remember, oh happy fault. It was good for him to have this problem, whatever it was, we don't know, because it was through this vulnerability, through this imperfection, that he was actually able to receive the transmission of grace. God's power, God says to him, my power is made perfect in weakness. And where faults or sin exists, grace abounds all the more, which is not what the ego, and certainly not what the religious ego, wants to understand. The ego, and especially the religious ego, thinks that we get more grace the better we are. But the truth that is revealed here is that our work, the working out of our salvation, is to accept ourselves as we are, first of all. And the transformation that comes through grace comes through that self-acceptance. Without that self-acceptance, that humility, there is no transformation. So this begins then, I think, to make sense of many other passages and phrases that we find in St. Paul. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or empty pride, he says. In other words, we begin to recognize where the ego sets traps for us, which we fall into without realizing it. Selfish ambition and empty pride become the motivation even for our spiritual practice at times. So we're reminded here of the importance of motivation. It's what we feel and what we feel motivated by that matters, not the external practice itself. This is why it's very helpful when you're beginning a spiritual practice, a discipline like meditation, to get it straight as far as possible at the beginning. It usually takes time for the penny to drop, for us to discover for ourselves what it means. But it's very helpful at least to be orientated in the right direction from the beginning. And that's why we make a distinction when we're introducing people to meditation between technique and discipline. It's very easy for us, especially today in a very instrumental kind of world that we live in, where everything is an instrument for something else. Everything is reduced to a measurable outcome or an evaluation. So it's very easy for us to approach meditation itself as if it were some kind of technique that we could master or become very good at. And we would get the outcome we want from it. Well, there's, that may be to some degree how we all start, but it shouldn't really be the motivation beyond the first, few months. If we do begin the practice, even with that mentality, that we are using meditation, and people often use that phrase at the beginning, I'm using meditation in order to, that's okay up to a point, but beyond that point, you stop talking about using meditation because you're beginning to understand through your own experience what discipline means. In other words, you're not in charge, you're not the driver, as it were. You're not in charge of this process. You are learning it. That's what disciple means. A disciple practices a discipline. The word discere means to learn. So you begin to see yourself not as a technician using the machine in order to get the desired result, but you see yourself as a disciple, learning through practice. And then again, understanding that helps us to understand why St. Paul also says, because it is God who works in you to will and to act on behalf of his good pleasure. Well, what that means is any good you do arises from the action of grace within you. So it is God who strikes the first spark. Our working out our salvation in fear and trembling with seriousness helps that spark to catch, to become a light and turn into a flame, the flame of love. So the starting point is that mysterious initial movement of grace in us beyond the range of our conscious understanding, beyond our horizon of observation. We can't see it, but we are the consequences of that initial creation, if you like. And when we begin to experience that, and meditation teaches us that because we begin to realize we're not technicians, we're disciples, then our image of God begins to change, our understanding of God begins to change. And this is why religious people sometimes find meditation more difficult than non-religious people. Because religious people have a very strong vested interest in their image or understanding of God, which they have received or they have built up themselves. And this is usually a God who is kind of an entity, a being, a higher being, to whom we relate but with whom we can negotiate or bargain or play games. Not playfully, but play business games. And what usually identifies that is our sense, or for many religious people, that the will of God, whatever that means, but the will of God can be influenced by our will. In other words, I want something, God has not given it to me yet, and I can influence this higher being to will what I will, or to change his mind. the best, this false image of God, and the tradition clearly identifies it as a false or an immature image of God, but it's one that you find in all religions, temples, mosques, and synagogues, and churches. What identifies that is is the mystical or the contemplative wisdom in all of these traditions. So there is an inbuilt tension between what you might call the instrumental God, who becomes an instrument of our will, and which is often embedded in religious practices, in various forms of devotion or superstition or magic. There's a difference between that and the mystical or the spiritual, the contemplative dimension of religion, in which something very different is taught. And if you take, for example, Julian of Norwich, a 14th century English mystic who wrote the first woman to write a book in English. She lived as a hermit, or was an anchoress in sort of great solitude, or at least in kind of locked up anyway by her own will, in quite a nice apartment actually, if you go to visit it in Norwich, and saw a lot of people. A lot of people came to see her from all over, and she gave great wisdom and advice and counsel. Her great little book is called The Revelations of Divine Love, and she's one of the great theologians in the Christian tradition, and very contemporary, as all of the great mystics are. When we read them, we are in touch with people who speak. They may not speak exactly our language, so you have to maybe look up a few things in the index, but they are speaking to us. They're speaking about what we are discovering. They're at the same level, and they're helping us. They're helping us to grow. And she has quite a funny section, actually, where she speaks about what happens when you don't get what you want in prayer. This is a problem many evangelicals, maybe Pentecostal Christians face, but not only them, and not only Christians. What happens when you make big offerings, or you live a good life, or you make a big donation, and you ask God for something, and you don't deserve what has come your way? Why doesn't God see things your way and give you what you want? And this is what is often called effective prayer. Why doesn't God effect why doesn't your prayer effect what God should be giving you? Why didn't you get what you want? It's a very important question. It's a question that actually everything about our spiritual maturity hangs on that question at a certain point. But because it is such an important question, we don't often look at it very seriously or for very long. It's like buying a lottery ticket. You know, you don't win one week, but you still buy it the next week. Because it's the buying of the ticket that gives you a little bit of consolation, or a little bit of false hope. Anyway, so Julian of Norwich deals with this in a light, but in a very profound way. And she sort of puts a spin on it. She says, well, you know, you may not get what you want, but keep on asking for it. And eventually, your perseverance will bring about a change in you and it will change what you want into what God wants. And when you want what God wants, you will get what you want. And actually, it makes a lot of sense, because what else is there? Jesus himself did the same thing in the Garden of Gethsemane. I don't want to have to go through my passion and death, but not what I want, what you want. So that transformation, it seems to us, this transformation of our human will, or our ego will, into the will of God, that is the real transformation that is at the heart of all spiritual practice. And therefore, in that, the very idea of the will of God becomes less intense and less of an opposition. So the Buddha also says we should strive with vigilance, his dying words. And the word for vigilance that he uses means, as it does in the Gospel also, the opposite of negligence, the opposite of, in Buddhist language, the opposite of intoxication or lack of awareness. When you've had a bit too much to drink, or done a little bit too much of anything, the edge of your awareness is dulled. Or even when we're just physically tired, we're just not as alert. We don't remember as much. Our judgment is impaired, and we make mistakes we wouldn't otherwise make. We don't see as clearly. Jesus says, "Stay awake and pray." To his disciples in Gethsemane, he said, "Could you not stay awake and pray with me for 1 hour?" And we need to stay awake because we do not know when the master of the house will come back. In all deep prayer, one of the fruits of any serious spiritual practice, working out our wholeness with seriousness, there is the gift of being able to live with uncertainty. According to neurologists who examine the way the two hemispheres of the brain operate, the right hemisphere of the brain, which is underdeveloped in our culture because we're all so left brain, so instrumental, so analytical, but when the right hemisphere of the brain is much happier about living with uncertainty. The left brain doesn't like uncertainty because it wants definition, it wants models of reality that it can worship. The right hemisphere of the brain, as in any creative person or in any loving person, can live with uncertainty because we cannot control the outcome of events. We don't even know what's going to happen next. So we do not know when the master of the house will come, but that's okay. Doesn't mean we're living in terror that the boss might come back and find us doing something we shouldn't be doing. It's that we can live with that uncertainty as part of our journey. This is why Shantideva says, as soon as we begin to take the second step and put the awakened mind into practice, we have to be realistic about this bodhisattva ideal. We want to become people who are committed not just to our own fulfillment, to our own right to happiness, but we want to be people who are concerned about the welfare of others. And as it so happens, that is what will be good for us as well. That is what will lead us to happiness. So that's what we want, that's what we aim for. But as soon as we begin to practice that, we realize our faults and failings. I promised to liberate the whole universe and to relieve suffering. That really was good for my ego, to think of myself as this bodhisattva type of person. But look at me. Look at who I am. Who am I to imagine myself as being capable of this? And this is where, in both of these traditions we're looking at, there is an identification of some of the impediments, some of the obstacles, some of the problems that we are going, each one of us is going to find, all of us is going to find within ourselves. These are internal obstructions. We can't blame anything on the outside. We can't blame God, we can't blame the people we're living with, we can't blame our parents, we can't blame those who have done us harm, ultimately. Ultimately. Of course, we're conditioned by all those things. But once we've started the awakening mind, once we've started to follow or to take refuge, then we take responsibility for ourselves. Work out your own salvation. Now, we have no doubt to have help to get to that point, but that is an early point we should reach in our spiritual practice. So we'll just end today on these two lists of these faults. In the Desert Fathers, the early Christian monks, Evagrius in particular, identified what they call the 8 principal faults, which later became the 7 deadly sins, which some of us may have learned as children from the Catechism. But it's better to think of them not as 7 deadly sins that we should be punished for, but as 8 main problems that we are all subject to. The seeds of these exist in our minds, in ourselves, and they will be germinated by circumstances or by patterns. So, gluttony, greed. The difference between those is interesting. Gluttony means stuffing yourself with too many things, much more than you need, whether it's shopping or whether it's food. Gluttony is overconsumption. Greed is the fantasy of unrestrained desire. We don't accept and recognize our limits. So gluttony, avarice, lust, anger, achadia, vainglory, and pride. Vainglory is the private feeling we have that we are superior to other people. We may not give expression to that, but within ourselves, that's what we feel. I'm really smarter, nicer, better, whatever, than others. Pride is where we put that into practice, and we demand that we are treated with more respect or adulation, or that other people should know who I am and treat me accordingly. So these are 8 faults that Evagrius and the Desert Fathers worked with. It was kind of a psychological system which helped keep the monks focused on their spiritual path. It wasn't that they had to beat themselves up because they had these problems. and you may not have all these problems at the same time, but you probably begin, after a few years, you begin to recognize certain patterns of the way they appear and combine. And in the Tibetan tradition, they have what's called 5 faults. Some of them rather similar, but also with interesting differences. Laziness, forgetting the teaching, in particular, forgetting how to meditate, forgetting to put it into practice. So it's like, you come to meditation and you've forgotten you're supposed to be meditating. So, for example, you forget that you're supposed to be saying the mantra. So you just sit there and sort of wallow in whatever mood you're in at the moment. So forgetting the teaching. Agitation. Being unnecessarily, we might say, being unnecessarily excited. We look in our culture for constant stimulation. One of the reasons people don't get enough sleep at night is, so I was reading the other day, we watch too many Netflix episodes before we go to bed. So the agitated mind, which actually becomes something of an addiction or a habit. On the other hand, there's dullness, where, for example, you don't sharpen your mind, you don't read. You don't train the mind. So either too tight or too loose is the way they express it. And another fault to be alert to is non-application, is the way it's translated. And it means you can see what you should do, you can see the remedies that are there in order to help you, but you don't take them. I read somewhere, I think it may be, when working with the doctors in Ireland, that 50% of people who are given prescriptions don't take their medication. It's great for the pharmaceutical industry. But 50%. In other words, you feel ill, you go to the doctor, the nurse or the doctor gives you something, you take it, you go home with it, and then you don't take it. Or you only take it for, 1 or 2 days. So non-application, not using the remedies that are available to us. And the opposite of that is over-application, where you take too much medication. Or, as they would say very wisely, you keep taking the medication after the sickness has passed. You don't need it anymore. So there are certain practices that you might find very helpful, little spiritual disciplines that you might find helpful for a period of time, but then there's a time where you don't need them. So you need the sharpness of mind, the awakened mind, to be able to see when you can let go of some of these remedies as well. So we'll now make our way upstairs and say the mantra, and which will simplify all of this. And saying the mantra, we can think of, I think, as a way of awakening the mind. It's why we listen to the mantra. It's why we give our full attention to it. It's sharpening our awareness, our mind. And once the mind it's a bit like, when you have a knife in the kitchen that's got dull and you can't cut with it. And then you sharpen it in some way. And then you can use it anywhere for any operation in the kitchen. So in the same way, the work of saying the mantra is like sharpening our mind gently. But then once our awareness, our mind and heart have become more awake, that benefits us in everything we do.